Hi students, welcome back. Today we'll be beginning the cardiovascular system. I will cover chapters 21 and 22. If you are a Mesa College student, I will also be covering chapter 20. But if you are not a Mesa College student, I'll only be covering chapters 21, the heart, and chapters 22, the vessels. So let's go ahead and get started. And let's just kind of look at the main function of the heart. And although the heart is a very complex organ and is obviously vital to all other systems, the main function of the heart is just to keep blood in motion. The heart, as you know, the majority of it is made up of cardiac muscle, and that cardiac muscle is constantly contracting to move blood throughout your vessels. And that blood staying in motion is meant to maintain homeostasis. If you think about all of the components found in blood that are required for life, there are things like oxygen, glucose, different types of proteins, hormones, enzymes. We've got to move CO2 out of cells and out through the respiratory system. And these are just a few examples. If you think about what happens when blood stops, when blood is no longer in motion, it clots or it thickens up. And so these things that I've just mentioned can no longer be delivered to the cells so that the cells can use them for their daily activities. So the heart's primary responsibility is to keep blood in motion to maintain homeostasis. And this is kind of a neat figure down here. It's not something I'm going to test you on, but it's interesting to note that the volume of blood that the heart can pump can vary between 5 and 30 liters. Now, of course, we're Americans. We don't use the metric system, not in our daily lives. But if you think about what 5 liters is, that's 2.5 2-liter bottles of soda. So think of a 2-liter bottle of Coke or 2-liter bottle of Sprite, whatever it is. That would be 2.5 of those per minute, but all the way up to 30 liters per minute. That would be 15 liters of Coke per minute. Now, of course, not everybody has the ability to go between these two values, or their heart doesn't have the ability to pump within that range. But just kind of remember that smaller individuals are going to pump less, larger individuals are going to pump more. At rest, your heart is going to pump less blood per minute, and while you exercise, that heart is going to pump more blood per minute. So that's where we get that pretty large range. But I wanted to give you something to compare that range. We can divide the cardiovascular system up into two different circuits. There's the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. And that pulmonary circuit, what it's doing, and let me just change pens, it is taking carbon dioxide rich blood. HB is just the symbol for hemoglobin, which is what's carrying the carbon dioxide. So the pulmonary circuit is carrying carbon dioxide rich blood from the heart to the lungs, and from the lungs back to the heart. So I'm going to just kind of outline here for you what the pulmonary circuit would be. So in this case, what you see here in blue are vessels that are carrying carbon dioxide rich blood to the lungs. Now that carbon dioxide is going to be exchanged at the lungs, and it's going to be exchanged for oxygen. So that blood then, once we release CO2, is going to pick up oxygen, and that oxygenated blood is going to be carried back to the heart. So that's the pulmonary circuit. The systemic circuit would include everything else. So all of these other blood vessels would be included in the systemic circuit. And that systemic circuit is carrying oxygen-rich blood from the heart to the body. So, let's see. I'll just try and use black again. So we're going to be carrying oxygen-rich blood from the heart, and that oxygen-rich blood is going to go up towards the head and the neck, right? And it's going to come down and go out to the periphery. And also going to go out the arms, right? They're just making this graphic really simple. They're not showing you all of the blood vessels. And that systemic circuit is also then carrying deoxygenated blood back to the heart. So that deoxygenated blood would come to the periphery and make its way back to the heart. Now, kind of remember what happens. We'll talk more about this when we get to the vessels lecture, the blood vessels lecture. But imagine here in red, you're seeing oxygenated blood flow to the periphery, right, to the rest of the body. And at these structures right here, right where you see where it turns from red to blue, oxygen is going to diffuse out of the blood vessels and into the tissues. But at the same time, the CO2 that those tissues have produced are going to make their way back into these blood vessels, and then that carbon dioxide rich blood is carried back to the heart. Again, we'll learn more about this when we get to blood vessels, which will be coming up next week. Just real basically, if you want to look at the orientation of the heart, I took this image from the Complete Anatomy app, and you can just kind of barely see. I've faded it, but you can barely see the sternum here. So the heart lies posterior to the sternum, or behind the sternum, in a body cavity that we learned about in the very first week of class called the mediastinum, or you might hear it referred to as the mediastinum. I don't mind which one you use, which term you use. But it lies slightly off the midline. So if you use black, if this were the midline, right, that imaginary line that goes right down your body, that separates your body in two, the majority of the heart lies just to the left of the midline. And that surface that you see is the anterior surface of the heart is mostly, all of this is mostly right ventricle and right atrium that you see there. So that's how it sits, just posterior to the sternum. Here's just another really neat picture that you can see from the Complete Anatomy app, and this shows you the positioning of the heart without any of the bones in the way. And I'll just write on here. So this is going to be the right ventricle. Things we're all going to learn about here in a few minutes. This would be the right atrium. This just gives you some perspective. This would be the superior vena cava. And down here would be the inferior vena cava. Over here, there's this sort of dividing line, and then this would be the left ventricle, and it's a lot bigger than you see from this perspective. You're only seeing just a part of it. And the same is true then for the left atrium. You're only seeing a part of it from this view. And this major blood vessel right here is called the aorta. Again, we'll get to more of this here in just a second. No, but the coronary vessels, I could draw a couple of them on here. Coronary vessels are vessels that wrap around the crown of the heart or the top of the heart. So here's one, and at certain points they branch and they vascularize the muscle here, the cardiac muscle. And it's those vessels that are the primary tributaries, so to speak, to the cardiac muscle. So they're carrying oxygenated blood that is high in not only oxygen but nutrients as well. If one of those becomes blocked by a clot, for instance, and blood can no longer travel to the cardiac muscle like it had before, that cardiac muscle will die and become damaged, or maybe I should reverse that, will become damaged and or die very quickly. Well, here we are. Okay, so this is not an image from your textbook or from the Complete Anatomy app, but I like it because it's pretty simple to see everything all at once. So the heart is made up of 4 muscular chambers. There are 2 atria. If we were to use the singular form, we say atrium. And there are 2 ventricles. So there is a right atrium and a left atrium. So again, this is the right atrium. And over here is the left atrium. Those are both muscular chambers, and when I say muscle, I mean cardiac muscle. So these are spaces where blood accumulates. And then the other 2 muscular chambers are the left ventricle and the right ventricle. So those spaces, let me just highlight those for you. So in green, this is going to be the right ventricle, and in yellow over here, that's the left ventricle. So again, these are chambers that are created by cardiac muscle. So the red that you see all over here, the red muscular tissue that you see is all cardiac muscle, even here. I'm going to go ahead and erase those colors just so we don't get too messy here. And I'd like to now discuss with you the valves. There are 4 valves that regulate blood flow through the heart. And those 4 valves exist between the chambers. So the first ones we'll learn about that exist between the right atrium and the right ventricle, or the left atrium and the left ventricle, those are called atrioventricular valves. Atrioventricular tells you where those valves are located. They're located between the atria and the ventricles. So this one right here, let me get rid of all that. This one right here is the right atrioventricular valve. And that's a valve that's going to regulate blood flow between the right atrium and this space down here, the right ventricle. So it's almost like a doorway, and a door that only opens in one direction. Now there's another term that's used more often clinically than calling it the right atrioventricular valve, and that term is the tricuspid valve. That's probably the one that you'll learn in nursing school or somewhere along in your careers. And then over here on the left side, we're going to have the left atrioventricular valve, or the left AV valve. And that's going to be found between the left atrium and the left ventricle. So here's the left atrium, here's the left ventricle, and the valve you find regulating blood flow between those 2 chambers. Again, this one has an alternative name that can be called the bicuspid valve, and that's used more clinically. or sometimes it's called the mitral valve or the mitral valve, depending on who's pronouncing it, right? But either term is correct. So that valve actually has 3 different terms. One of the distinguishing features of these valves are that they have structures called chordae tendineae. And these chordae tendineae, I'll just switch my color here, these chordae tendineae, that literally translates into heartstrings. So these structures here, those are the chordae tendineae, and they're anchored to small muscles of the ventricles. These are called papillary muscles. And what those chordae tendineae do is when those papillary muscles contract, remember this is a papillary muscle right here, those papillary muscles contract when the ventricles contract. And when the papillary muscles contract, they pull on the chordae tendineae. And it doesn't pull the valves open. That's a really common thought among students, and it appears as though that's what they would do. It does not pull those AV valves open. What it does is when the papillary muscles contract, they put tension on the chordae tendineae, and it holds those valves shut. Remember what's happening here is that when the ventricles contract, what they would really like to do is push blood out through either the pulmonary trunk or push blood out through the aorta. And in order to regulate blood flow in the correct direction, we can't have these AV valves opening. Because if they did, when the ventricles contracted, blood would flow right back to where it came from, right back into those atria. So when the papillary muscles contract, they pull on the chordae tendineae, and they prevent these AV valves from opening up and letting blood regurgitate back into the atria. So give me a sec, let me erase all this so it's not so messy. And we'll move on to the pulmonary valves. The semilunar valves. So the other 2 valves, remember there are 4, the other 2 valves are what we call semilunar valves. And then, of course, each one has a different name. So there is the pulmonary valve, which is here, and there is the aortic valve. So when those ventricles contract, those valves open and allow blood to flow into the aorta, let me go back. When those valves open, when the ventricles contract, those valves open, and the blood from the right ventricle is going to go out the pulmonary trunk, and the blood from the left ventricle is going to go out the aorta. Now look at these valves. They do not have chordae tendineae. And so that's a distinguishing feature between the semilunar valves and the atrioventricular valves. And one last structure I just want to take note of here is this. That's the interventricular septum. That's a piece of cardiac muscle that separates the right ventricle from the left ventricle. There are some important structures here. You'll learn about what those structures are and what their function is when you get to your physiology course. This slide right here is just a textual representation of everything I went over on the previous slide. This kind of helps you to organize your thoughts and make sure that you get all the information that I just mentioned in the previous slide, so I won't reread this to you. Let's have a closer look at those valves using the pictures or the images from the Complete Anatomy app. And the picture on the left that you see here is an inferior view, an inferior and anterior view. So you're kind of looking up into the heart, and you can see that I removed the wall of the right atrium so that we can see inside. And what you can see here is the pulmonary valve, and I guess I'll show you its 3 cusps in green. So it's got 3 little flaps to it. And what you can recognize right away is that there are no chordae tendineae. And then over on the right-hand side, in the image on the right, you're looking down on the heart from the right side. So let me give you a little bit of perspective here. This is the right atrium. This would be the superior vena cava. And down here would be the right ventricle. Now what I've done is I've removed a portion of the aorta, which would have been right here, so that we can see the aortic semilunar valve right here. Let's go back. It's the heart. In this picture, you're seeing a slightly different view as well. You're looking up into the heart from a slightly slightly inferior view. And the first thing you'll notice are I'll use green. So there's the right AV valve, and you can see the chordae tendineae, those fibrous strings here. And then over on the left side, you can see the left AV valve, and you can see its chordae tendineae as well. These images here. Stop. So now that we understand a little bit of the anatomy of the heart, the 4 chambers, the 4 valves, let's have a look at the sac that surrounds the heart. And this sac is called the pericardial sac, or you may have heard of it called the parietal pericardium. So in the image on the left, what's being pulled back right here is that parietal pericardium, and it's mostly dense connective tissue, but it's got 2 other sublayers of tissue as well. It's, like I said, it has a layer of dense connective tissue, and that's going to be what you see here on the very outside in white. And then it also has a layer of areolar connective tissue, and that's what you see here in yellow. I'm outlining it in green. So that yellow tissue there is the areolar connective tissue. And then in addition to that, there's going to be a layer of simple squamous. And that simple squamous there we refer to as mesothelium or mesothelium. It's not epithelium because it's not on top or on the superficial surfaces of the body. Meso means middle, so this is a layer of simple squamous that's found in the middle layers of the body. So I'll show it to you right here. That's in purple, and you can see the outline of these cells, right? So they're very typical squamous shape. So those 3 sublayers make up this sac that surrounds the heart, called the parietal pericardium. The function or functions of the parietal pericardium are 1, to anchor the heart within the mediastinum and to surrounding structures, but also this layer right here, the mesothelium or that simple squamous that you see here, is a serous membrane. And remember that serous membranes secrete serous fluid. On the heart wall itself, and it's kind of difficult to see, so I'm going to zoom in here real quick. On the wall of the heart, which is all of this, on that outer wall there is going to be a layer of simple squamous. You can barely see it. This isn't the best representation, but there's another layer of mesothelium or simple squamous that acts as a serous membrane. So both that inner lining of the pericardial sac here, plus the outer layer of the heart wall itself are both serous membranes. And when they secrete serous fluid, this is going to create 2 very slippery surfaces that if the sac comes in contact with the wall of the heart, not a big deal. The heart is going to slide right past that pericardial sac without causing any damage. So now what I'd like to focus on is the anatomy of the wall of the heart itself. Those on beating. And if we move to the next slide, this slide details everything I'm about to say on the slide that we're going to advance to in a second. Again, this is just an organizational slide, so you can have everything written down for you that I'm just about to say, but I'd rather narrate that while we're looking at a picture rather than just reading a slide to you. So before I advance to that next slide, I'll just introduce the names of the layers of the wall of the heart. They're epicardium, also known as the visceral pericardium, myocardium, and endocardium. So we can find, so this is what we know as a heart attack. Let's have a look at those in the picture that we saw before. And the epicardium is going to be, I'll outline it in green. So that epicardium is here. And that epicardium is going to be made of two sublayers. A layer of simple squamous, you can just barely see there in purple, and that simple squamous is going to be bound to an underlying layer of areolar connective tissue that you see here in yellow. So those are the two sublayers that make up the epicardium. Now in between that and the innermost wall of the heart is going to be where we find the cardiac muscle. And that cardiac muscle goes from here to here. So this layer we call the myocardium. Myo meaning muscle. So this layer is made up of all cardiac muscle. And within that cardiac muscle, you can see very distinctly blood vessels here and here. And in fact, you can also see the shape of the cells. You can also see the intercalated discs. Check that out. There's an intercalated disc. You can see how these cells are branching in shape. Right? So this is something that we've seen before. This myocardium is very extensively vascularized because if you think about it, from about 6 weeks of embryological development up until the time that you die, this cardiac muscle is constantly contracting. And in order for those cardiac muscle cells to continue to contract, they need a good supply of nutrients, they need a good supply of oxygen, but in addition to that, those cells also require that waste products that are created by the cell, like CO2, for example, are removed, so that those things don't cause damage to the muscle cells themselves. Remember, cardiac muscle cells do not undergo mitosis, so they need to have several mechanisms, or the tissue needs to have mechanisms in which the cells that make up the tissue are protected, because they need to do their job over the course of your entire life. They never stop. If they stop, you stop. In fact, a heart attack is caused by restriction of blood flow to the cardiac muscle. And there are vessels that you're going to learn about in lab called the coronary vessels. So the vascularization of the cardiac muscle needs to be maintained continuously, otherwise that heart muscle will die. One of the last things I would like to cover with you is blood flow through the heart. And one of the most important things that you can understand right off the bat is that red indicates oxygenated blood and blue indicates deoxygenated blood. So maybe I'll write that here on the top for you. The blue coloration, indicates a vessel or a chamber is carrying or transporting deoxygenated blood. Another way to say deoxygenated blood would be carbon dioxide rich blood, because if blood doesn't have a lot of oxygen in it, it likely has a lot of carbon dioxide in it. And then the red vessels or chambers indicate oxygen-rich blood. Okay, so let's focus on the drawing first. You guys will need to know and perhaps even explain on an exam blood flow through the heart. And what's really important to know here is that both the right side and the left side are contracting at the same time. Students sometimes would like to think, well, the right atrium contracts first, and then the right ventricle, and then the left atrium, and then the left ventricle. No, that's not how this works. The heart beats in what we call an asynchronous pattern. And that means that if we have to start somewhere, we can just start with the atria. The atria contract first, and they contract at the same time. And when they do, they squeeze blood from the atria to the ventricles. So blood is going to flow from the right atrium into the right ventricle, and at the very same time, blood is going to flow from the left atrium to the left ventricle. Then those atria are going to relax. And when they're relaxing, they're refilling. They're going to draw blood in from the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava, as well as these pulmonary veins that you see here and here. So when they're not actively contracting, they are drawing in or pulling in blood from elsewhere, getting ready for the next contraction. So while those atria are relaxing, the ventricles then will contract. And let me see, maybe I'll use green for the ventricles. When the ventricles contract, they're going to be pushing blood into the major vessels that are carrying blood away from the heart. So these ventricles contract at the same time, and the right ventricle is going to push blood into that pulmonary trunk. The left ventricle is going to pump blood into the aorta. So those ventricles, when they contract, are going to push blood out of the heart. So you have this asynchronous beating of the heart where the atria contract first and then ventricles. Atria, then ventricles. Atria, then ventricles. Another way to understand this would be to follow the pathway of blood into the heart, to the lungs, back to the heart, and out to the body. So that's what this flow chart over here on the right shows you. It shows you the pathway, the continuous pathway through the heart, and I'll do that with the black pen now. So you have to still remember that the left atrium and the right atrium are contracting at the same time, and then the right ventricle and the left ventricle contract at the same time. But let's see what's happening here. So if we were to just track deoxygenated blood into the heart, think of where that's coming from. This superior vena cava right here is draining blood from the head and neck. And it's draining that blood from the head and neck back to the right atrium. The inferior vena cava is collecting blood from everywhere else. And so both of those vessels are going to collect blood and transport it to the right atrium. When that right atrium contracts, that deoxygenated blood gets sent into the right ventricle. When that right ventricle contracts, that deoxygenated blood makes its way out the pulmonary trunk and can go one of two directions. It can go to the left lung or it can go to the right lung. So let me see. Let me test my artistic abilities here. I'll draw a green lung. So here's the left lung, looks more like a kidney, and here is the right lung. It's at that point, remember, that this blood is carbon dioxide rich. So carbon dioxide is going to be dumped and oxygen will be picked up. So CO2 is sent into the alveoli of the lungs and exhaled, and at that same time oxygen is picked up. Okay, cool. Well, now we've got oxygenated blood, and that oxygenated blood is going to make its way back to the heart from both lungs. So from the left side of the lungs and from the right side of the lungs. These two vessels right here, called pulmonary arteries, they wrap around the back side of the heart. So you can't see them and where they dump blood, but you could just kind of imagine that those two right pulmonary arteries are going to dump their oxygenated blood into the left atrium there. And these left pulmonary arteries are going to be, pulmonary veins are going to be dumping their blood into the left atrium here. That left atrium contracts, pushes that oxygenated blood into the left ventricle, and then when that left ventricle contracts, it pushes blood out the aorta, and that blood is going to go up to the head and neck region. But you'll also see that the aorta curves, and you can't see it in the rest of the photo, but that aorta then will descend down the body and distribute that oxygenated blood to the systemic circuit, the rest of the systemic circuit. I'll see if I can find a good video and post it on our Canvas site so that you guys can see this in action. Otherwise, this photo is really good for showing you the direction of blood flow and the coloration. Remember, the blue coloration plus blue arrows indicate that that's the direction of blood flow of blood that's deoxygenated, and the red arrows and red structures are showing you blood and the direction of travel of that blood that has picked up oxygen or is oxygen rich. The last thing I want to mention that you'll probably learn, and maybe you already know, are heart sounds. The things that we're able to, the periods of contraction that we're able to hear when using a stethoscope. And the terms, these are the official terms, the lub and the dub. And that lub is the sound of these AV valves closing. They kind of slam shut. They kind of close with a bang, so to speak. So the lub is a much more distinct sound when listening to the heart through a stethoscope. And the dub is the sound of the semilunar valves closing. And they close a little bit more gently. So the dub is indicative of those semilunar valves closing and is a much fainter sound. The importance of this is when you're hearing those sounds, you know what period of contraction the heart is in. So when you hear the lub, the louder slamming of the doors, you know that the ventricles are contracting. And what I mean by that is when these valves close, when these AV valves close, they're closing because the ventricles here and here are about to contract. We need blood to go from the ventricles into either that pulmonary trunk or the aorta. What cannot happen is blood cannot backflow from where it came from into those atria. So these valves here, these AV valves, they close so that blood can't get pushed back into those atria. And one of the structures that helps keep those valves closed when these ventricles contract are the chordae tendineae. If you recall, those chordae tendineae are those little strings, right? The little connective tissue strings here. So when the ventricles contract, so do these papillary muscles. And those papillary muscles pull on the chordae tendineae. And that keeps these valves shut during the very strong contraction of the ventricles. So when those valves are shut, not a problem. Blood can't backflow into the atria. Blood then either gets pushed out into that pulmonary trunk or blood makes its way into the aorta. So it allows healthcare workers, when you're listening to these heart sounds, it allows healthcare workers to determine which period of contraction the heart is in. And the dub, let me erase some of this. The dub, like I mentioned earlier, which is a much fainter sound, is the sound that's made, remember, when the semilunar valves are contracting. Remember, semilunar valves are these valves right here. So when those valves are closed, that's preventing blood from being pushed into either the aorta or the pulmonary trunk. That means that the atria are now able to push their blood into both of the ventricles. So we're only allowing for blood flow from the atria into the ventricles and not allowing for blood to pass into either the pulmonary trunk or the aorta. So that's essentially the functioning of those 4 valves, is to regulate blood flow in the correct direction. And by listening to those heart sounds, we're able to determine what's happening in the heart without actually being able to see the heart. Okay, that's it for this lecture. Stay tuned for the next lecture on Chapter 22, the blood vessels.